I'm over here at the R3 Corda documentation site, and I'm specifically at the Demobench basically page. It's under tools on their documentation website. Now, Demobench is basically a desktop app that you could download for you to essentially train on, run demos on, play around with, so on and so on. Now, there's again, the goal of being able to run a standalone desktop app is that you don't have to download like a full blockchain. You could play around to figure out how exactly it's going to work. You could, for demo purposes, it's beautiful because it really does show how the blockchain could work. You have the ability to upload DApps, core DApps, that is the proper term. But anyways, let's go ahead and go through how this would work. The first thing is I'd recommend, and the link is in the resources, go over here to tools and read about Demobench. And then what you want to do is go over here to the Corda website and download Corda Bench. So you select Demobench, and it's available for Windows, and it's available for Mac OS. And it goes through again how this would work, gives you some examples. I already have it installed locally. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and spin up my version of Demobench that I already had available. And so I'm going to go ahead and make sure it's in the window and resize this as appropriately as I can, so that the resolution's as good as I can get it. Okay, so when you start Corda Bench, you go to a default config. That's assuming that you start it the first time. Now, you have the chance to save the config that you had set up if you want. Now, as you can see, I had a notary node set up for Rome, and I already uploaded a test Corda DApp called Corda-Finance, and that's a Java file basically. But what I want to do now is let's do this. Let's go. The first thing we have to do is, if you notice, the new node hasn't been fully configured per se or started. So what I want to do first is I got to start the node. And you'll see that it's going to start up. And it'll take about 20 seconds at the most. And what it's doing is it's starting basically an Oracle Java virtual machine in the background. And if you just go help, you go help. What I want to do though is I just want to look at the version of the Java virtual machine. So I type in JVM, and then what I have to do now is I need to go over to the runtime, right? So show the runtime. So I'm going to go JVM runtime. So I could see that I'm running on my workstation an Oracle Corp version .2, basically runtime environment. And I could also, if I have a memory, I could also, go here, type in, let's say, pools. And again, it tells me the pools that were created, so on and so on. But you can play around with this. So this is actually running on a JVM. What I want to do now is I want to start creating other nodes, and then I want to perform some transactions. Let's go over here to add a node. Now, you'll see by default, it comes up with some interesting legal names. And I have the ability to, of course, change that if I want. What I want to do is call this, let's say, just so it's easy to identify, Friendly Bank in New York. And then I want to put in the city because this is important if I have to go to New York. And the closest city is New York. Now, I'm also going to leave the Corda app in there. And what I want to do, because remember, Corda is really meant for financial institutions for basically transaction processing, making payments, and other use cases that the institutions would have. But basically in this case here, I want this bank to be able to issue US dollars, but because we have some friends in Europe that they do a lot of business with, we want to make sure that they could also issue basically euros. And then what do I have to do? I have to go start the node. And once this starts, I could go do what? I could go view the JVM, right? JVM, and then I want to look at what? Runtime. And you can see that I have the JVM running. The runtime is 1.2. Okay. Now what I could do, you could see over here first that there's no states in the vault. There's no transactions and the balance is 0. What I want to do now is I want to create one more node. Now let's just clarify notary. What exactly is a notary? Well, that's a really, really good question. Essentially, a notary is going to prevent what's called double spending. And essentially, you don't want someone to overdraw their account, right? When you're sending funds, if they have $100, they can only spend what? $100. Also, too, they can also process transactions, but they could also basically be used as well to attest to, right? Sort of similar to validate, but they're basically attesting is sort of similar to what you would do with the notary service in the US, where you go to a notary, bring your photo ID, you sign in front of them, and what they do is they attest, basically saying that that's you. And basically the notary service is a service that's going to provide that uniqueness attestation that it's actually you sending the transaction. So you have to sign the transaction, and it's up to the notary to basically say it's unique or not, that it's you. So they either will sign it or they'll reject it. Those are generally the two things that a notary can do, at least in Corda. Okay, so what we want to do now, so we know what a notary is. And then if we go over here, we still need another bank, because what I need is I have to create another bank so that I could send funds from one bank to another. Remember, the notary is there for basically preventing double spend. So let's go over here to the friendly bank and add a node. Now what I want to do, let's make this geographically dispersed, is I want to call this the Bank of, let's say Singapore. Okay, so this is, and to make it, this is the friendly Bank of Singapore. And what do I want to do? I want to go select Singapore from the list. And they could issue US dollars, and they could also issue euros. And then what do I have to do? I have to start the node. So what we want to do now is I got to have two nodes up at least. I need a notary. And then I want to send a transaction from either New York to Singapore or Singapore to New York. And let's just validate that our VM is good to go. And again, what is it? JVM. And then I'm going to type, what is it? Runtime. And again, same version, so on and so on. Good deal. Now, let's go view the database. Now, the database is actually going to pop up right here. Let me go ahead and place it. And this is running SQL. So you could see that this is running essentially SQL, right? Execute current SQL statements. You have all these other statements, right? So this is SQL. As of right now, I have the ability to run SQL queries. Let's go ahead and hold off on that. And let's go back here so you can see the database. Now, let's go ahead and launch the Explorer. Now, when I launch the Explorer, this will pop up another window, and I could view transactions that have occurred and the network itself. Now, when I go here, you can see that there's no transactions. Nothing in the treasury. I go to transactions here, and you can see that there's no transactions. That makes sense, right? Now, let's go to cash, because we didn't do anything yet. I'm just showing you so you could see what we have. Now, let's go to the network. And when I look at the world map, you could see, let's go ahead and minimize this, or actually it's hard to see here. And you can see I have the bank, Friendly Bank in New York. I have the notary over in Italy. And I have the Friendly Bank of Singapore out in Singapore. So it gives me this world view. And then what I could do is I could exit from here if I want. But I want to just show you one more thing here. And you can see it tells me my identity. Because by default, I was in the Bank of Singapore, so you have to pay attention to where you're located, of course. It tells you the notary location, and then it tells me my peers. What I want to do now is go over to settings, and if I wanted to, I could change the reporting currency. I could also have it point to another node if I want. But let's go back to the dashboard. So we don't see anything going on here, so we got to fix that. Let's go over here to exit the Explorer. So now I've exited the Explorer. Let's go over to Notary and the Friendly Bank of New York and Singapore and just validate what we see. Okay, so now what we want to do is I need to send some funds from, let's say, the Friendly Bank in New York to the Friendly Bank of Singapore. So the first thing, though, is I've got to go and issue some funds so that I could send those funds. Okay, let's go ahead now and go over to the Bank of New York and validate that the machine is running, and it is. Okay. Now what we want to do is I'd like to send some funds from Bank of New York to the Bank of Singapore. Now to do that, I have to go over to the Explorer. So I select the Explorer. And essentially, the Explorer is a graphical user interface, a GUI, that, and let me go ahead and fix the screen here, that is going to allow me to view my network. It's going to allow me to view my peers and also initiate transactions as well. Now I go to the dashboard, you can see that there's 0 transactions and there's nothing in the treasury as well. What I want to do now is I need to go over to cash. So what I want to do is I want to act like a central bank, and the way you act like a central bank is you gotta create a new transaction, and the transaction type would have to be issue. Now, I'm going to issue the funds out of nowhere. Basically, I don't have any funds, but I'm going to go ahead and create money digitally, sort of like a central bank. And but just, no pun intended. But what I want to do now is the issue is going to be Bank of New York, and the one that's going to receive the funds is going to be the Friendly Bank of Singapore. Now, the currency will be in US dollars, and the amount is, let's say, $100,000. And what I want to do is execute that. And when you're looking, you could see in the back here, you should see a transaction occur pretty quickly. And it did. It was really fast. And you could see that the ID of the transaction is there. So it issued the cash. Well, let's go validate that. Let's go to transactions. And what you see here is that the issuer was the Bank of New York. And the command is here. $100,000. And then what happened was it moved that $100,000 from the Bank of New York to the Bank of Singapore. And if I go here and I expand, you could see that the cash that was received, this is the transaction ID, the signatures are down here. And basically it went from the Bank of New York to the Bank of Singapore. Now let's go back to the dashboard. And you can see that when I issued that cash, that created two transactions. Remember, when you issue funds, it's got to take the funds out of nowhere and place them into the bank that's going to send the money. And the bank that receives the money, basically is another transaction. So you can see that there's two transactions here. So pretty straightforward. So what we did is we just used a very simple blockchain application to initiate a transfer via basically an interbank application. Go back here, I have two transactions. Now, let's look at the Treasury. Well, there's no funds in the Treasury. And if I wanted to, what I'd have to do is I could go ahead and issue funds. Again, I could do this either way, from the Friendly Bank in New York to New York. I know it sounds stupid, but again, this is how it works in real life anyways. And I want it in US dollars, and then I could put in a reference. So I execute it. And you see the transaction occur. And you can see that in the Treasury, there's basically $100,000. Go back to the dashboard. You can see that there's 4 transactions. And you can see now that there's activity in the Treasury as well. So what we've done is we essentially created 2 peers. And basically those peers, one peer sent money to another peer. And then the Bank of New York essentially created additional funds and issued it to itself. Now, what about if I go back here and go to cash and I want to send another transaction? I could go ahead and pay. Because the Bank of New York has funds issued to it, I don't have to go and issue funds to New York. I could just pay from it. And then Singapore. Issuer, currency is in US dollars. And it says, here's the funds available. But let's say I just want to do something simple. $120,000 out of, 12, what is that? Let me just make sure. It's pretty hard for me to see with this. Okay, $12,000, right, out of what is it, $100,000. It's hard to see the zeros, at least on my end. Okay, so I go ahead and execute that, and you can see that it paid the cash. And now I have, from that $100,000, there's $88,000 left. So that makes sense, right? So $12,000 left my Treasury and got sent to the Bank of Singapore. So that's R3 Corda, Demobench. You can see the transaction also issued as well. Pretty nice utility. Go over to Demobench and download it. Again, the Windows installer is here. There's a Mac OS installer here. I would advise you just to read the instructions, and there's also some good videos on how to run it as well on YouTube.